to talk about the impact this strike has had on the labor movement as a whole and more. We have Adam King with us, assistant professor in the Labor Studies program over at the University of Manitoba. Good morning.
Good morning.
So after what I mentioned there, hearing from the CUPE president yesterday, I think this morning this ratified deal came to some as a surprise. What was your thought when you heard that a deal, a tentative deal rather, not ratified, a tentative deal had been reached?
I was somewhat surprised that it came this quickly, although my immediate reaction was that this is a vindication of why the right to strike is so important in the first place. Had CUPE complied with the original government directive to end their strike and enter arbitration, they would have been funneled into a bureaucratic process that would have taken likely a very long time. And at the end of it, the flight attendants themselves would have had no say over the deal that was ultimately put to them. And now, instead, CUPE defied that order, stayed out on what was, I guess, an illegal strike, although that's questionable. And the result is they got themselves a tentative agreement within a couple of days. So I think really this shows precisely why striking is so important and such a fundamental right.
So you think that the flight attendants' defiance for just to use that term gave them more leverage in this?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's no question. We heard yesterday the Air Canada CEO say that he expected that Section 107 would be enforced. And I guess by that he means that the government would swoop in and rescue the company when it essentially, forced these flight attendants into this position of having to strike. So we knew that the company all along was expecting the government to force these workers back. And so the company is unlikely to bargain seriously under those circumstances. And so the workers defying this, the union saying that they wouldn't comply with this directive, is precisely what got us a tentative agreement so quickly.
How often has that happened in the past, unions defying back to work orders in this country?
Well, it's pretty rare because the punishments for doing so can be very steep. They can be hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and potential jail time. As we heard the CUPE national president say yesterday, he was willing to go to jail over this. I mean, the last time a union leader went to jail over this is in the 70s with the postal workers president at the time. In 2022, CUPE education workers defied back to work legislation in Ontario. And a similar thing happened. The rest of the labor movement threatened a general strike in response, and the Ford government was forced to back down and rescind that legislation. And so I think what these two examples, the flight attendants and the education workers in Ontario, shows is that when governments interfere in collective bargaining, there are other options besides compliance. And maintaining the right to strike and defying these orders is sometimes the best course of action.
I'm going to totally flip this on its head and look at this from a different perspective now. Someone might say that it's because of the back to work legislation and that pressure that actually got this to, a tentative deal sooner because effectively it was, figure something out as travelers were, waiting to see what was going to happen next. What's your sense of that? And I just want to know, what do you think is going to happen next then in this country with the use of back to work orders?
Well, I think it's definitely the pressure of the strike that got us the tentative agreement, because it was the union's non-compliance really that actually put pressure on Air Canada, because CUPE made every indication yesterday that it was not going to comply with this order in the short term or long term. They were staying out until they got a deal. And I think that was a signal that, unless the government wanted to get really intense with the repression and the optics of that, I think were not great. I mean, arresting union leaders and punishing a union of predominantly female flight attendants that had a lot of public support, I don't think would have flown with the public. And so I think it's definitely the pressure of the strike that got us to where we are now. What I hope is that the government learns its lesson from this. I mean, over the past year, this government and the previous one have used Section 107 now 4 or 5 times against different unions. And unions have complied in the past, but what it's done is really undermine and erode the collective bargaining process in the federal jurisdiction. And it's signaled to employers that they don't need to bargain meaningfully. And that's why we ended up in the situation that we were in with Air Canada. So I hope that the government learns its lesson and stops interfering in collective bargaining and allows the collective bargaining process to function as it should.
What do you say to the average Canadian and traveler, though, or to those, no, I shouldn't say the average, to those that would say, that they're looking for a better solution moving forward overall. You just heard Volker Beckman from Thomson suggesting maybe more competition in the marketplace would help people have options as labor disputes happen. He also did say that he sympathized with the striking, workers as well. So, what's the way forward to, or is the, or do we even have an option in the way forward other than to have this kind of impact on the traveling public while the labor negotiations are ongoing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we start with rebalancing the scales of industrial relations by having the government stop with these forms of intervention that are unhelpful, inadvisable, and really questionable in terms of their legality. We still have cases before the courts actually to determine whether the government's use of Section 107 is actually lawful in the first place. And so that's the first step, really, because if we had had a round of bargaining here where the expectation was that the workers could go on strike if a deal wasn't reached and that the government wouldn't intervene, we may have had a deal without a strike. So the first thing I think is really to get back to basics there and respect the law when it comes to collective bargaining. But the second thing to say is that, unfortunately, the right to strike can be inconvenient and disruptive. And when you're in a public facing industry like the airlines, unfortunately, that is just par for the course. And sometimes strikes happen. I mean, we have far fewer strikes in Canada than we've had historically. There's been an uptick post pandemic, but when you compare it to the 70s or the 80s, it's nowhere near that level. So I think we do have to accept to a certain extent that workers' right to strike is important, despite the fact that it can sometimes be disruptive.
On Monday, the federal jobs minister, Patty Hajdu, called for an investigation into unpaid labor practices in Canada. What are some other industries where unpaid labor is an issue?
Well, I have to say that I found this announcement astonishing, that she was not aware that this practice was as widespread as it was in the airlines, I think is a bit troubling. And she said a couple of other things that were strange. She said that she checked with the labor program to see if there had been complaints filed. Well, these are union workers, so if there were any complaints, they'd be filed through the grievance process, not to the labor program, which deals with non-union workers. So a part of that announcement I found to just be astonishing and somewhat troubling. Certainly, this is an issue. Unpaid wages and wage theft generally are a major problem, not just in the federal jurisdiction, but really across the country. Employment standards departments in every province deal with this on a regular basis, and so if the government wants to probe this issue further, I would encourage them to do so. But in terms of the airlines, I mean, workers made clear that they wanted to deal with this through the bargaining process, and let's hope that the tentative agreement does that in an adequate way. But I think really the next step here is pretty plain, is to have legislation introduced federally to deal with this issue and to make sure that the airlines are in compliance with the rules around working time and compensation. And there's been legislation introduced by both opposition parties, actually, federally, before this. And so reviving that legislation, putting it in place, and ensuring that the airlines comply, I think is the next step.
I mentioned to listeners that I would ask at least some questions to try to get some clarity about what their day might look like. So just so people can understand, Adam, this is a tentative deal. So when people are hearing that things might not be back to normal for a week, there still could be cancellations. That's because, to ratify this, it's going to have to go through the full vote process, correct?
Yes, that's right. It's a tentative agreement. Members still need to meet with their union representatives, hear about the contents of the deal, and then vote on it. They have announced that they're going back to work and operations will resume. And some union members, I'm sure, are somewhat upset with that because it kind of puts the cart before the horse if you're returning to work and yet you haven't voted on the deal yet. So strategically, that can be a bit contentious within unions sometimes. And it also makes it very difficult if members vote down the deal to actually resume your strike. And due to a ruling of the labor board a couple of years ago, they determined that you have to reissue a strike notice if you want to put your picket lines back up. So that would introduce another hurdle. But everyone I think is hopeful that the contents of the deal are satisfactory to the members and that they vote ratify it. In which case, it'll be some time before Air Canada resumes full operations, I'm sure, but we're on the path toward that.
All right. Thank you very much, Adam. I'm sure we'll see, details of the contents of the deal once workers do and this continues to develop today. So really appreciate your analysis.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's Adam King with us live, assistant professor in labor studies at the University of Manitoba.